You can order it online anytime at cspan.org/shop or call us during business hours toll-free at 1-877-ON-C-SPAN. That's 1-877-662-7726. The U.S. Congressional Directory for the year 2000. Order your copy today.
Now a discussion on conservatives and higher education. Syndicated columnist Joe Sobran spoke about the issue of tolerance on college campuses during remarks Friday at a forum hosted by Accuracy in Academia. It's about 55 minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to get started here. My name's Jamie Rowe, and I'm a summer intern for Accuracy in Media. And I'm here to introduce the next speaker, and his name is Joseph Sobran. Joe Sobran is a nationally syndicated columnist and celebrated commentator on political and cultural matters. Spending 18 years as a senior editor of National Review, he is now a columnist for the Universal Press Syndicate. Mr. Sobran is the author of Single Issues, Essays on the Crucial Social Questions, and Alias Shakespeare, Solving the Greatest Literary Mystery of All Time. Mr. Sobran is a lecturer and speaker on major talk shows and conferences throughout the world. Mr. Sobran is married with 4 children, and now I'm pleased to introduce Joseph Sobran.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be addressing you again, and thank you for the nice welcome. This building, by the way, is named for Mr. David Krieger, the late David Krieger, who died a couple of years ago. I'm told there is a picture of, quote, Shakespeare upstairs. This seems to me a bit of insolence, because Mr. Krieger was a great believer in the truth that the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, was the real author of the Shakespeare works, as I've demonstrated to the satisfaction of any rational being in my book, Alias Shakespeare. I'm working on another one just to drive the point home. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was, I believe, a bisexual, which doesn't seem to have helped much in winning him acceptance in today's intellectual atmosphere. I feel the gay community let me down badly by not supporting my book. I even presented them with a slogan: he's here, he's queer, he's Edward de Vere. Ingrates. Well, it brings me to the first illustration of my theme of the bigotry of the tolerant. The treatment Dr. Laura Schlesinger is getting from the, quote, gay community. Her proposed TV show is being attacked in advance because she has said that homosexuality is deviant behavior and wrong. That's what she believes, that's what I believe, and that's what everyone really believes. And I say everyone because I don't believe those who say they approve of it. You know, there are a lot of people, there's a new kind of hypocrisy going on in this country where people, and the modern culture, in fact, it's subculture, I hope. I hate to call it culture. I hope it's just a fleeting thing. But I think there's plenty of reason to believe it's more than that. The surest proof of what I say is this. Nobody, however liberal and tolerant they may be toward homosexuality, nobody wishes it on anyone he loves. Nobody. I have never heard even the most liberal, expectant parents say, well, we don't care if it's a boy or a girl as long as it's gay or lesbian. You know, you don't want this to happen. It's an incapacity for normal happiness. You know, there's so many things that are just ruled out by it, obviously. Plus, it's disgusting. And that has been the general reaction to it. That's why there are jokes about it. That's why we laugh at Barney Frank. I'd hate to live in a world in which Barney was considered normal. In fact, I kind of think he would. I think he kind of gets a kick out of being cute, you know? But anyway, the attitude I'm going to talk about at some length was summed up by Chesterton when he spoke of the modern and morbid habit of always sacrificing the normal to the abnormal. Notice the word normal is now put in quotes, as is the word natural. Well, there was a time, and I think there still is a time, and I think there always will be a time, when people believed and do and will believe in the categories of the normal and the natural. I don't think you can do without them. I think every healthy culture has to have a strong sense of what's normal and what isn't. And you can't just change the normal. In his wonderful little book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis talks about this. He says we can no more invent a new value than we can invent a new primary color. There is one and only one natural law, or to use the Chinese term that he uses, the Tao, the way. And it's basically universal. There are variations in the way it's applied, but still it cuts across cultures. Now, the people who deny this in the name of tolerance have a strange way of showing the most ferocious intolerance toward people who affirm it, as we all find. We're all used to the idea of liberal double standards by now. In fact, that's why accuracy in media and accuracy in academia are in existence, basically. Because these people do not live by the standards they preach. It's been said that tolerance is what rising groups demand and then deny to others once they get into power. And I think that's borne out. By the way, the people who used to demand tolerance are now extending the very opposite. In fact, as you've seen, as you've witnessed many times, as you know, the advocates of what you might call the old order, the normal order, are being persecuted now, actively persecuted. I don't mean they're being killed now, here, but they suffer. They take risks when they say what they think, and the other side means to keep it that way. Let me just cut to the most vivid example I've seen lately, John Rocker. As you know, John Rocker is a baseball player in addition to being a shrewd and distinguished social critic. He got in all kinds of trouble a few months ago for saying what I thought were perfectly unobjectionable things. In fact, I thought as a portrait of New York City, it was a bit on the pastel side. He was called a racist and a bigot. He didn't mention race. He mentioned purple hair. No offense to you white people, but that sounds like he's describing a white kid to me. I've never seen a non-white with purple hair. I've only seen whites. And I thought what he was really talking about was trashy people, aggressively trashy people of all races, of which there is no shortage, especially in New York. As witnessed this week's events in the city, as you probably know also, Sunday there was a Puerto Rican National Pride Day parade. And during that parade, a bunch of youths, as the papers delicately put it, or as Joe Pesci would say, utes, ran wild, assaulting women, stripping them, fondling them, even robbing them. And I noticed an interesting thing. It wasn't until today in the Washington Times that I saw one newspaper report that made explicit the racial angle in this, that it was a non-white assault on white women. I mean, white women were singled out. If this had been a bunch of whites rioting and molesting black women that way, you'd never hear the end of it. They would put the racial angle front and center. But when it's the other way around, they won't touch it. It's a fascinating thing. In fact, given the way the New York Times practices this kind of ethnic prudery, I wonder why they didn't, on the same principles, avoid all mention of sex. Why didn't they just say that some persons had torn the clothes off other persons? In some cases, while the spouse of the other person was being withheld from defending the victim. But anyway, if you piece the story together and you find that so many of these people were tourists from France and England and the rest, you know, everybody really knew what was what. But it's one of the wonderful features of the tolerant liberal press that they will not acknowledge any racial spite in the other direction. Now notice, when we're talking about white atrocities against non-whites, they can be centuries or decades old, and they'll be commemorated forever. You know, there'll be anniversaries and TV movies and mini dramas and all the rest of it, Roots, etc. And the racial angle will be emphasized. But they won't mention the racial angle in anti-white crimes that occur every day. An amazing fact. Now, does the race really matter? Well, it matters to the people who think it matters. Therefore, it matters. I mean, race may be superficial and fictional and all that, but if some people are going to kill on the basis of race or do serious injury to others, then it matters. It matters that it's a belief. It matters that it constitutes a source of loyalty for some people. Now, we're always hearing about multiculturalism, too. I'm not sure what it really means, but I know it doesn't have anything to do with what it says it's about. Because if you take different cultures seriously, what do you realize? That they are different. That there's a difference between a Dutchman, say, and a Ubangi. I don't see why that should be scandalous, because after all, that's why we have anthropology. In fact, the West has always been remarkably curious about other cultures, which is one way its culture does differ sharply from most cultures. Most cultures are, as they say, ethnocentric. That's what a culture is. Culture is a way of saying, this is our way of life, these are our sacred symbols, this is our religion, and this is how we're going to live in accordance with all that. Now, the fiction of liberalism is that all the people of the world aspire to be like nice, middle-class, suburban white people. Well, some people do, but I submit that a lot of people obviously don't. They really don't look up to white people. They want some of the things that the American, European-derived culture provides, of course, the great conveniences and comforts and wealth, but they don't all want to emulate whites. Let's get over that. It's a silly idea. It's so naive. And yet we're supposed to think when people don't emulate us, it's our fault. Why? What is going on here? I tell you, I've never gotten to the bottom of it. By the way, this business about, the New York Times reporting the sex but not the race of the offenders and victims, when both, I think, are essential to understanding the story, provokes this thought. We're always hearing now, these parallels between sex and race, or gender, as they like to say, and sexual orientation. These are not parallel categories. They're vastly different from each other. Different in all sorts of ways. And to talk as if they all call for the same kind of response, i.e., of course, always more federal, quote, civil rights legislation, And of course, civil rights is another of those terms that has come to mean the opposite of what it ostensibly means. Whenever you hear the term civil rights, you know you're going to wind up with less freedom, don't you? You know you're going to be under more scrutiny from the state. You're going to have fewer options in your life. You're more likely to be penalized even for behavior you don't even think of as wrong, let alone malicious. That's the way we live now. So we've come to be too inured to these outrages, as I may call them. They've become part of the structure of life in America in the age of Clinton. Didn't start with him, but he rides it. He aggravates it. He's an opportunist. Another example, the Confederate flag flap. Well, personally, I think the cause of the Confederacy was essentially a noble one. I think that the Civil War was, on the Southern side, a fight for freedom for whites. Now, it wasn't a fight for freedom for blacks, but neither was the American Revolution. You can't have everything at once. The Northern cause was the cause of, quote, saving the Union, which meant actually denying the right of anyone to leave the Union, denying the right to leave the Union under any circumstances. Lincoln was not particularly interested in freeing all the slaves. He didn't free any slaves in the loyal slave states. He freed only those he had no authority over, as Lord Palmerston observed at the time. But saving the Union was a dogma for him. He told Horace Greeley if he could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, he'd do it. If he could if he could save it without freeing any slave, he would do it. He said at the beginning, in his first inaugural address, he didn't think he had any authority to touch slavery where it already existed. So that wasn't even an issue. He was even willing to support a constitutional amendment protecting slavery in the states where it already existed. Now, the ultimate result of that war, I put it to you, was Roe v. Wade. Because what the war established was not that all men have the right to freedom, or that all men have unalienable rights. What it established is that all Americans have an unalienable government, one they can't shake off under any circumstances. Once the federal government had the power to overwhelm any state, to deny it the right to secede, then it was only a matter of time before the Supreme Court would declare that the states had no right to protect innocent unborn life. They could make it stick, thanks to the Civil War. They knew there would be no secession. If the right of secession had been preserved, they wouldn't have dared issue Roe v. Wade. Now, that's just one of many corollaries of the Civil War. But that's the way to look at it. You have to look at it in terms of power. What it established is that the federal government is the 800-pound gorilla. And that was what the South was fighting against. I heartily commend to you the memoirs of Jefferson Davis, if only the chapters in which he argues the cause, the constitutional cause of the South. It's brilliant, and it almost makes me regret that Lincoln was shot. Because if he lived, he would have had to face Davis in debate, not personal face-to-face confrontation, but I mean, he would have had to answer Jefferson Davis's arguments, and they were powerful. I don't see any way out. Lincoln was, among other things, a great sophist. Anyway, I mention this because of the Confederate flag fuss. Now, some people say, well, the Confederate flag is a symbol of slavery. Obviously, to them, it's a symbol of slavery. And I could see even arguing that it shouldn't be made a state symbol. Nevertheless, I regret that the flag has been pulled down, and I again want to raise the little issue of double standards. If these people are so scandalized by slavery, why do so many of them want to be called African Americans? Do they know where slavery came from? It wasn't invented by Jefferson Davis. It wasn't invented by anyone. It's been around for all of recorded history, pretty much, at least in any highly developed and centralized society. By the way, another argument against centralizing power. Makes it easier for the law, maybe an argument against the state itself, actually. At any rate, power should be dispersed as much as possible. All men should be free. Slavery is intrinsically wrong, and yet it is a common human institution and always has been. In Africa, it was not a spectacularly humane institution. Slavery in Africa has not been wiped out yet. It persists in Mauritania and Sudan. And it was even more widespread just a few decades ago. I read a book by an Englishman writing in the 20s about his vain attempts to persuade a slave that he should flee his master. Now, here's what African slavery was like. Very often, the slaves were acquired from other tribes by kidnapping. It was a very common problem. The tribe would wake up in the morning and find some of its children missing. Imagine living like that, in that kind of fear. And these children would then be raised in other tribes, and they'd grow up not knowing who their real parents were, and often quite attached to their masters, however cruel their masters were, and they could be cruel. There were times when they used, well, it was common for them to use various forms of mutilation, such as castration and blinding, or other ways of crippling slaves so they couldn't run away. Now, in America, slavery was tempered by Christianity. I'm not defending it, I'm not cheering for it, I'm not excusing it, but I am saying you ought to make a distinction between that kind of slavery and the kind that, as I say, persisted so long in Africa itself. I don't know why anyone who professes to hate slavery and the Confederate flag as a symbol thereof should look at Africa as anything else. I mean, it's funny to damn the old South and yet glorify Africa as if it was the happy homeland. Hey, that's where your ancestors were bought and sold, pal. Well, what's going on here? We always hear about racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, sexism, ethnocentrism, xenophobia, McCarthyism. What am I leaving out? Oh, homophobia. I love that one. Homophobia. I guess once the Supreme Court discovers that pedophilia is a basic constitutional right, we'll be hearing about pedophobia. Fear of children. Somebody, you don't like children? You got a problem with children? Whereas the people who do have a problem with children, such as the Earl of Oxford, I'm afraid, will get off scot-free. I don't mean to defend the guy at all, but I do think that was one of his vices, and you have to understand that to understand the Shakespeare story. But I wasn't invited here, was I, Dan, to talk about Shakespeare? I just slip it in every now and then. Plugging my product. Speaking of plugging my product, I'd like to mention I do have a newsletter. You can find directions to get there at my website, www.sobran.com. Very simple. So check it out, as they say in New York. Okay, well, we have all these ideas, as I say. They always express what? They're all about the hostility of the native or the alien. Oh, nativism is the word I forgot. The native for the alien, the minority, or the majority for the minority, the normal for the abnormal, so to speak. Always going one way. What's missing from this picture? We never hear about reciprocal hostilities. I mean, you would think the minority might harbor a grudge against the majority now and then, or that the alien might hate the native now and then. I mean, we're seeing it, folks, but this is not recognized. We have a moral map in which we have an east but not a west, a north but not a south. There's a terrific asymmetry here, and this is what we really mean by double standards. I coined a word. You can take this home and use it yourselves if you like. for this missing concept. I call it alienism, the glorification of the alien, the abnormal, the minority, and the corresponding denigration of the majority and the native and the normal. I'm not saying one is better or worse than the other. I'm just saying you can't understand the whole system unless you understand this. In the Shakespeare works, without reference to their author, you find that Shakespeare actually assumes that that society is usually right and the dissident or disaffected individual is wrong. Whether it's Shylock or Richard III or Edmund the Bastard, he's got a whole lot of villains and they're socially maladjusted people. Even Cassius and Iago, in a way. Now, he's not saying that there are, well, I'm not suggesting there are inherent and insuperable differences amongst the races. I don't deny that there may be, but I don't think that really works as an explanation. I think we're talking about different cultures here. And different cultures are different. They come down to different ways of even perceiving the world, let alone acting in it. And one of the defining things about modern Western man is his obsession with measure. Everything we depend on in our lives technologically is a result of this fantastic attention to measurement. All our engineering depends on precision, on making interchangeable parts, and so forth. And other cultures can adopt this, as the Oriental cultures have. But the idea that the white man stole it from somebody, again, that's a piece of this alienated ideology, which I call alienism. I have a little joke about it. A tribe, I won't say where, wakes up one day and the witch doctor runs up to the chief. Says, Chief. Chief says, what's the matter? Says, the white man came again last night and stole the wheel. And chief says, well, so what? Make another one. He says, I can't. He stole the blueprint too. Well, you can't steal a way of thinking. You can adopt it. You can't deprive its originator of it, however. He's going to be the one who thought of it in the first place. And so, European man is going to continue doing what he does. We were told that this country was built on the backs of slaves. Okay, so what? Africa was built on the backs of slaves to the same extent, right? So how do you explain the difference? It's obviously a huge cultural difference. And people like their own cultures. They're all ethnocentric. We can't expect that they're going to change even when they come here. Some will, some won't. They're free individuals, but they do act as groups, and they often have these group attitudes, including hate for another group. And as I say, the minority is more likely to feel it than the majority. The majority doesn't have to have any particular feelings about the minority, but the minority can't help having such feelings about the majority. Who's going to be thinking about height all day long? A 6-footer or a dwarf? That answers the question. I was told how offensive that analogy was one time. Yes, I'm very offensive. I like to get real. That's offensive. But, oh, it's amazing what you can be denounced for. Poor Rocker. If he only had a little humor, you know, if he could only make a bit of a joke of it, he'd be hosting Saturday Night Live now. But no, he takes it too seriously, and he keeps getting himself in deeper and deeper. He ought to treat this thing as the joke it is. But apparently he's getting all homicidal about it. But again, I cite Chesterton, the modern and the morbid habit of always sacrificing the normal to the abnormal. That's what we have now. You know, we're not supposed to use words like normal or perversion or deviant. Deviant. Can't even say that. Or you're a deviant, an ideological deviant. As many people have pointed out, diversity, or as they say in New York, diversity, We want diversity in everything but ideas. That's liberalism for you. And the minorities, or as they're sometimes called, the minorities, that's Jesse Jackson talk. The minorities are always right, and the majority is always wrong. Except, of course, when there's a black majority and a white minority. Then it's different. But, I mean, this ideology is all around us. You know, it's one of those things you don't notice because it's so omnipresent. I'll give you another example. I think the ultimate target of all this is not the white man as such. I think it's Christianity. In 20th century, we've seen a persecution of Christians more ferocious than even in the ancient Roman Empire. In fact, there's no comparison. Millions of Christians have been killed for their religion in our time, and mostly by the communists. There's a new book about this by my good friend Bob Royal, a great scholar and a fine Catholic, called The Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, just published by Crossroads. I'll warmly recommend that too. It's a very eye-opening book. You have no idea how many people have been killed and martyred. There's a difference, of course, for their faith in our time. He's concentrating on the Catholics. There are many others too, as he acknowledges. Eastern Orthodox, Protestant, and others. They have died for their faith, willingly, in many, many cases. In fact, he says it's surprising how few of the clergy, the Catholic clergy, back down from bearing witness, even with the threat of torture and death. It's an amazing story and really appalling. There's a catalog of physical tortures used in Albania alone that would make you lose your lunch if I read it to you. It's just astounding that there was such human courage, and I have to believe divine grace. As he says, there have been many people who've died for other beliefs too. People who died for Nazism, for communism, but they didn't die blessing those who killed them. That's the difference between them and the Christian martyrs. It's a wonderful story. I mean, it's very grim, and yet it's very inspiring too. I think there could be people of such courage and faith. But what interests me is that after millions of Christian deaths, there's still no name for the process. We have a name for the Holocaust. We have, as I say, all these other words, slavery, and racism and sexism and homophobia, ageism and heightism. I mean, they come up with new ones every day. You can coin your own. Yet we don't have a word or any sort of symbol for this very widespread attempt to exterminate Christianity. It's still going on in this country in a polite form, usually in the name of separation of church and state. But it is an attempt to wipe out Christian tradition, especially to exclude it from public life. And this is one of the great liberal causes. As Peter Viereck, conservative of the last generation, once observed, anti-Catholicism is the anti-Semitism of the intellectuals, the bigotry of the tolerant, as it were. Notice, too, the vocabulary of liberalism. Liberalism can't tell you to go to hell because it doesn't believe in hell. What does it do? It consigns you to the past, calls you a caveman, antediluvian, reactionary, outmoded, 13th century or 18th century, whatever. I think its favorite curse word is medieval. What could be worse than that? The Middle Ages, the time when civilization was Catholic, a liberal's nightmare. And so the great liberal categories are progressive and reactionary. And the progressive is that which takes us furthest from the Catholic era of the Middle Ages. The reactionary is that which takes us back toward the Middle Ages. Notice when you get past the Middle Ages, it gets better again, right? The ancient world was okay. The Greeks and the Romans, wonderful. Even though, of course, they did have slavery and sodomy and pederasty and infanticide and crucifixion and a number of other amusements. That's okay. In the alienated mind, the ancient world tends to be glorified. Another classic of the last century, Fustel de Coulanges, The Ancient City, really demolished that idea. He showed just how bleak and harrowing the pagan world really was, how ridden with superstition and cruelty it was. Everything liberals say about the Spanish Inquisition was basically true of daily life in the ancient world. By the way, speaking of the Spanish Inquisition, you know, over about 3 centuries, 3 1/3 centuries, the Spanish Inquisition executed perhaps 5,000 people. Now, that was a slow week for Lenin, Stalin, Hitler. But yet, the Spanish Inquisition remains a liberal byword for the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages themselves, though their history is somewhat in the dark, actually a lot has been recovered now, and it's probably no longer appropriate to speak of it that way. But the Dark Ages were the greatest era of genuine moral progress in human history. And again, the alienist ideology turns everything on its head. But if you think about it, it was during the Dark Ages that Europe was rid of infanticide, abortion. Of course, that's a black mark against it for the liberal. But, you know, this kind of male domination of the paterfamilias, where a man could whimsically divorce his wife. Crucifixion and other forms of torture were abolished, though some remain. And of course, the medieval civilization is blamed for everything it didn't get rid of. You'd think it had invented all these things when they were merely survivals. But slavery disappeared, and before it disappeared, it was humanized, because the slave was the equal of the freeman, and the freeman had duties to his slave, because both had immortal souls. Now, St. Paul says so, in fact. It doesn't say we must abolish slavery. He simply says that a Christian slave and a Christian freeman are one in Christ. So servants or slaves were to be obedient to their masters. But at any rate, the Dark Ages did get rid of all sorts of things that the ancient world had taken for granted, such as the sexual abuse of boys. You know, the ancient world apparently saw little to object to in this. I don't know, because I'm not a classicist, but my impression is that it was simply taken for granted as a fact of life. And in fact, it did make a comeback in the Renaissance. In Italy, it was so rife that St. Philip Neri was always denouncing it in his sermons. A recent book says that half the men in medieval or in Renaissance Florence at one point had been accused of this awful vice. It was that common, and it was regarded with great tolerance in those days. So, anyway, the real moral map of the world is very different from the one that liberal or alienist ideology presents us with. The races do differ, at least in deep-seated cultural ways, and a culture is a whole way of looking at the world and constructing the world symbolically. So naturally, people of different racial origins are going to be often antagonistic. They're going to have trouble adjusting to each other and getting along with each other, and it's not necessarily the fault of one side or the other, and that's rarely all the fault of one side. So if you're white, you should feel kind of guilty, but not that guilty. Let's get them feeling guilty too. That's all. I certainly don't mean to say that a racial explanation is sufficient. In fact, I would say just the opposite. I'd say ultimately we all do have immortal souls, that this is one of the great truths of the West. And when you're dealing with other races, you've got to be two things. You've got to be wary, and we're learning that more and more as these social problems, as they're euphemistically called, keep assailing us, as in New York the other day. Yes, you do have to be wary. You have to be on the lookout for the hostility on the other side. At the same time, I have a little saying, look for the angels. And this applies to everybody, to all races. Never cheat yourself of the goodness and friendship you may find across the border of race, religion, language, whatever. There are always wonderful individuals out there, and you certainly rob yourself if you deprive yourself of their company and their warmth. So anyway, with that dual moral for all this, I thank you for your attention. And should I take questions? Yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them. Thank you very much. Okay, yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, I've seen in a couple of your articles on the internet, which I read every Tuesday and Thursday. They're so refreshing. I love getting home from school. I teach school. I love getting home and reading them, man. It's like a little mini party I have by myself every day. But I've been looking for information. You talk about Bill Clinton referring to some church burnings in Arkansas that actually never occurred. He made this up. I find that despicable, but I have not been able to find that evidence. I want to be able to see that written down somewhere that he said that. I can't find that anywhere.
I think he said it on TV, but I may be imagining things. Does anyone remember it? It was during the wave of church burnings a couple of years ago, maybe 4 years ago. Anyway, he said it reminded him of similar occurrences in his home state of Arkansas in 1964. Then that turned out not to be true, so then he changed the story a little bit to try to make it true, and it turned out the alternative version he'd come up with was also falsifiable. And I can't tell you, I can't give you a source. Maybe Mr. Irvine can. Welcome, Reed. Do you remember Bill Clinton's lies about the church burnings in Arkansas?
Yeah, he said, Bill Clinton said he remembered them well.
Right. They made a deep, indelible impression on him, as did Rosa Parks when he was 9 years old. Remember, he said that he and his little friends took to riding in the back of the bus in solidarity with Rosa Parks. Now, there's the most precocious social conscience in the history of social conscience. 9 years old. I mean, he didn't even know who Rosa Parks was. He probably didn't know what a bus was at that age. Yeah, sorry I can't give more precise references on that. You know, I have already demanded that somebody, in fact, I assigned this to Ann Coulter. I don't know if she's going to do it. Somebody has got to provide a concise encyclopedia of Clinton scandals. I mean, there are too many of them now. They have to be indexed and cross-referenced and everything. You've got to be able to say, Wu, who's that, Wong? Oh, yeah. Billy Dale? Yeah, you know, look him up, get a fast figure, and nobody can keep him straight anymore. Okay, next question.
Mr. Sobran, I was just wondering if you could answer two questions. The first one, I was just wondering if you could give your thoughts on the Republican Party, what direction, just in general, like what they could possibly do to improve. And number two, I understand you're running for vice president.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
But what, you want a job?
I was just going to ask if you ever considered running for Congress or Senate or something. I don't know.
Too much work.
No.
No, I couldn't do that. No, the Republican Party, in my opinion, has well, it was conceived in iniquity. It was the party that started the Civil War. It was the party that wanted to deny the right of secession. And it has improved somewhat, but not enough. There are individual Republicans I greatly esteem, like Congressman Ron Paul of Texas. But basically, the Republicans have gotten almost as bad as the Democrats. Nobody could be quite as bad because the Democrats keep moving left too fast, but the Republicans are sort of huffing and puffing behind. See, they're both consolidating parties. The great debate at the foundation of this country, over the Constitution, was whether it was going to be a federal or a consolidated government. Everybody agreed in principle that it should be a federal government, that is, a federation of sovereign states. But instead, it became, with the Civil War, a consolidated government, which everybody had opposed in the first place. That is, a centralized government. Now, it didn't become really, really centralized until the New Deal. But after that, there's been no stopping it. And the Republican Party has ceased insisting that new federal powers be justified by the Constitution. The Constitution gives only a handful of powers to the federal government, and it says clearly in the 10th Amendment that all other powers are denied to the federal government, reserved, therefore, to the states and the people. This is not a states' rights amendment. It's a limited federal powers amendment. Now, if you don't stand for restoring the Constitution, you stand ultimately for a totally consolidated and therefore tyrannical government. So that's why I think it's, you know, if the Republican Party were even trying to go back toward the norm, the American genius of dividing power, you see. You can think of the Constitution as an antitrust act for government, meaning no single government shall have a monopoly of power, and no branch of the government shall have a monopoly of power. But even more important, no level of government shall have a monopoly of power, neither state nor federal. Dividing power, that's the key to liberty, as Lord Acton said. Yeah? Or Miss? I'm sorry, I can't see.
Mr. Sobran, at my campus, it seems that many of the students involved in various black student groups or African American student groups like to discuss what they call institutionalized racism. And I would like to know your thoughts on that. It seems that they, not only just this concept of institutionalized racism, but also this guilt that I'm supposed to feel because my skin is white and my great-grandparents came here in the 20th century, and my family did not earn all of this wealth that keeps the black man down. They earned their living in the same way that most, I think the large majority of white Americans did. But I'm constantly hearing this argument that white people have this advanced place in society because of the wealth that was obtained in slavery, and that there's this institutionalized racism. And I'd really like to have your thoughts so I can have a really strong argument.
As I say, how come all of today's Africans aren't rich from selling slaves? I mean, they owned and sold slaves, so they ought to really be rich, right? Well, why aren't they? I think there's obviously a qualitative difference in the cultures that accounts for all these disparities. Look, my argument against all these people is, talk about things like institutional racism is, you're the racist. You're the white supremacist. Because according to you, everything that happens in this world is caused by whites. Whites alone have free will and causal power. Other races don't. Other races can't control their fate. Only the super white man can control anyone's fate, his own and others. And this goes beyond Hitler. Hitler never claimed this much for Germans or Aryans. But here the whites are supposed to, if we're going to take responsibility and guilt for everything, why don't we take the credit too? I mean, it's ridiculous. We're only human. And so are they. We all are. We're all in this together. And these ideologies are always trying to load all the guilt on one side. That's the nature of ideology. That's why I'm against it. That's why I think, in fact, it's an inherently fraudulent mental structure. When, it's the same way with all this business of sexism. You know, everything that happens is the men's fault. Men control everything. Well, it is a man's world, as they say. The male in every species tends to dominate. There are exceptions. But, I mean, the exceptions, in a sense, do prove the rule. Actually, the original version of that saying means the exception tests the rule. But anyway, the exceptions exemplify the rule that one sex or the other is going to predominate, in general. But we can modify that, and we should. And the West has, to a great extent. Now, there's always more to be done and negotiated. That's fine. Notice the word change. Clinton came in saying he was for change. And even Republicans do this now. We're for change. What does that mean? How about stability? How about tradition? Change what? Change on what principle? How much? I mean, the idiocy of it. And yet it presupposes there's something radically wrong with the way society is already organized. So we're even going to change marriage, are we? Why not restore marriage instead of changing it even more? Maybe that would be the proper form of reform. In fact, as G.K. Chesterton says, it is futile to discuss reform without discussing form. You reform something by restoring its original form. That's what you do. You don't just make it more and more different from itself. I mean, you see this alienist spirit all through modern culture. Look at modern art, if you can bear to. The word skill has disappeared from art criticism. An artist with manifest skill now is looked down on, accused of just copying the world. How a terrible thing to do. Anyway, yes, sir.
Good afternoon. You've certainly made it clear that you opposed and thought that the federal government had overstepped its bounds in trying to prevent the Confederacy from seceding from the Union. If I recall correctly, perhaps you can help me with the facts, that Barry Goldwater was pretty much a lone voice on principle in opposing a federal civil rights push.
Right.
At what point, and I don't mean to make this a loaded question, but at what point is it more important for a Christian principle to have precedence over a conservative principle?
Well, I think conservative and Christian principles generally harmonize. I know that in my own thinking, I try to make conservatism the application of Christian principles to the real world. I think there are some kinds of conservatism that become ideologies and therefore come into conflict with Christianity. Especially, I think, in the military sphere. Conservatives have been too quick to approve of warfare in the name of patriotism. And this is wrong. I mean, I think we were wrong to get into both world wars, and we should have stayed out of Korea and Vietnam as well. I don't say this in an anti-American spirit. I think America lost something of itself by getting involved in all these foreign wars. I should mention the Spanish-American War and a number of other interventions, too. I hope they go without saying. I mean, the phrase common defense has been as badly abused as the phrase general welfare. Now, both of these have become rubber phrases to justify anything. So, okay, well, thank you very much. Been a very kind audience. I appreciate it.